There are moments in life when everything you've built simply falls apart. For Sterling Vaughan, that moment came at 45 when he lost his wife, his children, and every shred of dignity he thought he had left. With $300 and nowhere to go, he bought an abandoned piece of land nobody wanted, an overgrown garden buried under years of wild vines and weeds. The locals called it cursed. Sterling just called it quiet. As he began clearing the tangled mess, he found something hidden beneath the ruins, a stone vault containing the journals of a botanist who had also lost everything but found a way to rebuild. What this forgotten garden would teach Sterling about starting over would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The divorce papers sat on the passenger seat of Sterling Vaughan's truck, edges worn from being folded and unfolded too many times. He'd stopped reading them weeks ago, but he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. They represented the official end of 18 years that had contained everything he thought mattered. Sterling pulled into the gravel lot of Morrison's Real Estate, a small office wedged between a hardware store and a diner in the town of Ridgemont. The building looked as tired as he felt. He sat there for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to remember when he'd last felt something other than numb. 45 years old. That's what the mirror told him this morning, though the face looking back seemed decades older. The grey at his temples had spread like frost across dark soil. Lines creased his forehead, worry lines his wife used to call them. His ex-wife. He had to remember that now. Judith had been clear in her reasons. She'd found someone else, someone younger, someone who didn't bring work stress home every evening, someone who listened, someone who was there. The custody battle had been brief and brutal. Their daughter Brooke was 22, their son Kent 24, both legally adults, both choosing to stay with their mother. Not because Sterling was a bad father, the lawyer had explained, but because Judith had the house, the stability, the life they knew. Sterling had nothing. His career in architecture had crumbled alongside his marriage. Morrison & Aldrich, the firm where he'd worked for 15 years, had downsized. Last hired, first fired, except Sterling had been there longer than most. They'd called it restructuring. He'd called it what it was. They couldn't afford to keep him, and his recent performance had given them cause. Hard to focus on blueprints when your marriage is disintegrating. The severance had been modest. After legal fees and splitting assets with Judith, after 6 months of temporary housing and job hunting in a market that didn't want middle-aged architects, Sterling was down to his last few $100s and a 15-year-old truck that burned oil. He'd been searching rental listings when he saw it. 5 acres on the outskirts of Ridgemont, sale price so low it seemed like a typo. The listing description was sparse. Estate property as is, cash only. The photos showed jungle-like overgrowth, crumbling stone structures barely visible through vines. Sterling pushed open the real estate office door. A bell chimed overhead. The agent, a woman in her 60s with short silver hair and practical glasses, looked up from her desk. "Mr. Vaughan, I'm Peggy Morrison. We spoke on the phone. Thank you for seeing me on short notice," Sterling said. Peggy gestured to a chair across from her desk. Her office was neat but dated, with property listings pinned to a corkboard and a coffee maker gurgling in the corner. "I have to be honest with you," she said, settling into her chair. "That property you're interested in, the old Crow estate, it's been sitting on our books for almost 20 years. 20 years? Sterling leaned forward. "Why hasn't anyone bought it?" "People around here have long memories." Peggy opened a file folder. "The place has a reputation. Old Aldrich Crow lived there alone for nearly 30 years. Died in 1987, found by the mailman 3 days later. No one wanted the property then, and the market wasn't what it is now. It went through probate, sat abandoned, taxes piled up. County seized it eventually, sold it to a speculator who went bankrupt. It's changed hands 4 times since, always at a loss." "What kind of reputation?" Sterling asked. Peggy measured her words carefully. "Folks say it's cursed. That's superstition, of course, but it keeps buyers away. Strange noises at night, they claim. Cold spots even in summer. One family tried to clear the land back in '95. Lasted 3 days before they packed up and left. Said the place felt wrong. Sterling looked at the listing photos again. Beneath the wild growth, he could see traces of intentional design. Stone archways, what might have been pathways, the remnants of something beautiful, buried under decades of neglect. "I need to see it," he said. Peggy studied him for a moment. "Mr. Vaughan, can I speak plainly?" "Please. You told me on the phone you're going through some changes. I don't know your situation, but that property, it's not suitable for living. No utilities, structures are unsafe, and the nearest neighbor is half a mile away. If you're looking for a fresh start, there are better options." "I can't afford better options," Sterling said quietly. "And I don't need much. Just somewhere quiet." Something in Peggy's expression softened. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize a person at the end of their rope. "All right," she said. "Let's go take a look." The drive took 20 minutes, winding through pine forests and past scattered farms. The road narrowed to gravel, then dirt. Finally, Peggy turned onto an overgrown driveway, marked only by 2 listing stone pillars, their surfaces covered in moss. Sterling's truck followed her sedan up the winding drive. Tree branches scraped both sides of the vehicle. Then the forest opened into a clearing, and Sterling saw it. 5 acres of absolute wilderness. Vines thick as his arm coiled around collapsed trellises. What had once been garden beds were now chaotic tangles of wild growth. Stone pathways disappeared under moss and leaf litter, and everywhere were the bones of something deliberately crafted. Arched doorways leading nowhere, crumbling walls that might have enclosed garden rooms. A fountain, dry and choked with debris, its basin cracked but still beautiful. Sterling stepped out of the truck. The air smelled of rich earth and growing things. Birds called from the surrounding forest. Despite the overgrowth, despite the decay, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Peace. "It's magnificent," he said. Peggy raised her eyebrows. "It's a jungle." "It's both." Sterling walked toward the nearest archway, pushing aside hanging vines. The stonework was solid despite its age, fitted together with care. Someone had built this to last. Someone put their heart into this place. "Aldrich Crowe did that," Peggy said, following him. "After his son died and his wife left him, spent everything he had building these gardens. Neighbors said he went mad with grief, but I think he just needed something to pour himself into." Sterling understood that impulse completely. They walked the property for an hour. Sterling saw potential where Peggy saw problems. The stone structures were salvageable. The land was level and well-drained. There was a spring-fed stream running through the eastern edge. With work, a great deal of work, this could be something again. "I'll take it," Sterling said when they returned to the vehicles. "Mr. Vaughan, please think about this overnight." "I've thought about it." He looked at the wild garden, at the forgotten beauty waiting beneath years of neglect. "This place needs someone, and I need somewhere to be. We'll figure each other out." Peggy sighed, but she nodded. "All right, I'll draw up the papers. Cash sale, as is." "You understand there's no recourse if you find problems?" "I understand." 3 days later, Sterling owned 5 acres of overgrown land that everyone else thought was cursed. He moved his few possessions onto the property in the back of his truck: a tent, a sleeping bag, some tools, clothes, and a camp stove. The divorce papers he finally threw away. That first night, sleeping in his tent beneath a canopy of stars, visible through gaps in the forest, Sterling felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just exhaustion finally giving way to acceptance. But as he drifted off to sleep, listening to the night sounds of his new home, he thought about Aldrich Crowe, a man who'd lost everything and built beauty from grief. If Aldrich could do it, maybe Sterling could too. The rusted key to his truck sat on a flat stone beside his tent, catching moonlight. It was the last thing from his old life that still worked. Tomorrow he'd start building something new. Sterling woke to birdsong and the realization that every muscle in his body ached. He'd spent the previous day clearing brush with a borrowed machete, and his hands were covered in blisters despite the work gloves. But the pain felt clean somehow. Honest in a way the last year of his life hadn't been. He made coffee on his camp stove and surveyed the section he'd cleared yesterday. 20 square feet of reclaimed pathway, the old stone finally visible beneath decades of accumulated leaves and moss. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The work became his rhythm. Wake at dawn, eat something simple, work until the heat drove him to shade, rest, work until dusk, read by lantern light, sleep. His savings dwindled as he bought basic supplies, more tools, tarps, rope, bags of cement mix for the worst of the crumbling stonework. But the physical labor quieted something in his mind that had been screaming since the divorce. 2 weeks into clearing the western section, Sterling noticed something odd. The pattern of stones beneath the overgrowth wasn't random. They formed deliberate shapes, geometric designs that suggested intention. He worked more carefully, following the pattern as it emerged from the earth. The pattern led to what he'd thought was just another collapsed section of wall. But as he pulled away the thick curtain of ivy, Sterling realized it wasn't a wall at all. It was an archway, still intact, its keystone carved with a symbol he didn't recognize. Something about the arch felt different. The stones around it were fitted more precisely than the others, the mortar work more careful. Sterling spent the afternoon clearing the area around the archway. The vines fought him, their roots dug deep into every crack and crevice. By the time the sun angled low through the trees, he'd exposed the full structure. It was beautiful work, each stone selected for how it would catch the light. Behind the archway, partially collapsed inward, was more stonework. Not a wall, but something else. Sterling pulled away more debris and stopped. It was a door, or rather the remnants of one. The wooden door itself had rotted away decades ago, but the stone frame remained, and behind it, darkness. His hands trembled slightly as he cleared the entrance. The opening led down, 3 stone steps descending into the earth. Some kind of cellar or storage vault. He'd need a flashlight to see more, and the day was fading. Sterling forced himself to stop, to go back to his camp and wait for morning. That night he couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to that dark opening in the earth, to the careful construction that suggested whatever lay below mattered to someone. To Aldrich Crow, he assumed. What would a grieving man hide in the ground? Dawn couldn't come fast enough. Sterling grabbed his largest flashlight and returned to the archway. The 3 stone steps were slick with moisture, but solid. He descended carefully, the flashlight beam cutting through darkness that felt thick and close. The vault was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, the ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. The walls were stone, the floor packed earth, and the air smelled of dampened time. But the space was dry, protected by the careful construction above it, and it wasn't empty. Against the far wall stood a wooden shelf, handmade, its boards warped with age, but still intact. On the shelf sat a collection of items that made Sterling's breath catch. Books, no, journals, their leather covers dark with age. Beside them, tubes that might contain rolled papers or documents, small wooden boxes, and in the corner, a metal container, sealed against moisture. Sterling approached slowly, as if the objects might vanish if he moved too quickly. His flashlight played across the journal's spines. No titles, just dates, marked in faded ink. 1959, 1963, 1970. The collection spanned decades. He reached for the earliest journal with careful hands. The leather was cool and smooth, well made. Sterling opened to the first page and read the neat handwriting there. My name is Aldrich Crow. I'm 42 years old. My son died 3 months ago. My wife left me 2 months ago. I have decided that rather than follow my son into the ground, I will build something that might outlast my grief. This journal will document that building. Sterling sat down on the stone steps, journal in hand, and kept reading. Aldrich's entries were detailed and honest in equal measure. He wrote about his son, a young man of 26 who died in a construction accident. He wrote about his wife's inability to bear the grief, how their sorrow had pushed them apart instead of together. He wrote about standing at the edge of his property, looking at 5 acres of bare land, and deciding to create something beautiful from nothing. The early entries were raw with pain. Aldrich wrote about days when he couldn't get out of bed, nights when he stood in his son's empty room and couldn't remember how to breathe. But mixed with the grief were detailed plans, garden designs, lists of plants and their meanings, sketches of archways and pathways. "I will build a garden of grief," Aldrich had written, "a place where sorrow can be walked through, step by step, until it transforms into something bearable." 4 sections: loss, reflection, growth, renewal. "If I can walk that path myself, perhaps others might someday walk it too." Sterling read until his flashlight dimmed. He climbed back up the stone steps, blinking in the bright morning sun, and realized hours had passed. His coffee from dawn was cold in its cup back at camp. He returned to the vault with fresh batteries and pulled out the next journal. Then the next. Aldrich had documented everything, his designs, his plantings, his failures and successes. He'd studied horticulture from books, learned stonework from trial and error. He'd spent his modest savings and then his son's life insurance money pouring everything into the garden. In the tubes were rolled drawings, detailed maps of the property showing each section and its purpose. The wooden boxes contained seeds, carefully labeled and dated, varieties Aldrich had cultivated himself. The metal container held photographs, his son as a boy, as a young man, his wife on their wedding day, and photos of the garden in various stages of completion, showing what Sterling's wild jungle had once been. It had been magnificent, structured, yet natural, with stone pathways winding through carefully planned plantings, each section distinct but flowing into the next. The archways weren't decorative, they were thresholds, marking passage from one emotional state to another. Sterling sat in that underground vault until darkness fell above, reading by flashlight, studying Aldrich's careful documentation of transformation. Here was a man who'd lost everything that mattered and decided to build something meaningful from the rubble of his life. The final journal ended abruptly in 1987. The last entry read, 28 years I've worked this land. I am 70 years old now, and tired. But the garden stands. If someone finds these journals after I'm gone, know this: grief doesn't disappear, but it can be transformed. What we build from our pain can shelter others. That's legacy enough. Sterling climbed out of the vault as full darkness settled over the property. He stood beneath the archway, looking out at the overgrown wilderness, and for the first time since the divorce, he felt something beyond his own pain. He felt connected to something larger, to Aldrich's vision, to the possibility of transformation, to the idea that what we build from grief might matter to someone else someday. He had found more than journals in that vault. He'd found a purpose. Sterling spread Aldrich's garden map across a flat stone, weighing down the corners with rocks. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the ink remained clear. 4 sections, just as Aldrich had written about: loss, reflection, growth, renewal. Each section was marked with detailed notes about plantings, stone placements, and even suggested walking paths. The map showed what the property had been at its peak. Sterling looked from the paper to the reality around him. 30 years of abandonment had reclaimed almost everything. But the bones were still there. The archways, the pathways, the fundamental structure Aldrich had built with his own hands. Sterling made a decision. He would restore the garden, following Aldrich's original design. Not just clear it, but bring it back to what it was meant to be. He had time, he had need, and now he had purpose. He started with the loss section, the first quadrant nearest the entrance. According to Aldrich's notes, this area had been planted with dark-leaved plants and deep purples, visual representations of grief's weight. The pathways here were deliberately narrow, almost claustrophobic, designed to evoke the suffocating nature of fresh sorrow. The work was harder than Sterling expected. His architectural training helped him understand structure, but he'd never done this kind of physical labor before. His hands, soft from years behind a desk, developed calluses that broke and bled and formed again. His back ached constantly, Sunburn turned his neck and arms red, then brown. But something was happening inside him too. Each day of work loosened something that had been locked tight in his chest since Judith told him she was leaving. The repetitive motion of clearing, digging, lifting became a kind of meditation. His mind quieted. The constant replay of arguments and failures faded into the background. 3 weeks into the restoration, Sterling had his first visitor. He was working near the road, clearing the main entrance pathway, when a voice called out. Didn't think anyone would actually move onto this place. Sterling looked up to see a woman in her late 50s standing at the edge of the property. She wore practical jeans and a gardening shirt, her grey hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her face was weathered in the way that spoke of years spent outdoors. "Sterling Vaughan," he said, wiping his hand on his jeans before offering it. "Willa Brennan? They live about half a mile that way." She pointed east through the trees. "Taught at Ridgemont Elementary for 30 years before I retired. Been watching someone move around over here, got curious. Sorry if I've been disturbing the peace." "Peace?" Willa laughed. "This place hasn't had peace in decades. Everyone around here thought it was cursed after old Aldrich died. Strange noises, cold spots, the usual nonsense people invent when something makes them uncomfortable." Sterling smiled slightly. "I haven't noticed any cold spots. Just a lot of overgrown garden." Willa stepped closer, looking at the section Sterling had cleared. Her expression changed from casual interest to something more focused. "You're following the original pathways. You remember how it looked?" "I was just a girl, but my mother used to bring me here sometimes. Aldrich would let local people walk the gardens, especially folks who were grieving. My mother came after her sister died. She'd walk these paths for hours." Willa's eyes grew distant. "I remember thinking it was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. All that stone and green, the way the light came through the archways. It felt sacred somehow." Sterling gestured to the flat stone where he'd spread Aldrich's map. "I found his journals. He documented everything, his designs, his intentions. I'm trying to restore it the way he intended." Willa approached the map carefully, her eyes widening as she recognized the layout. "Lord, I haven't seen this in 40 years, but I remember it exactly." She traced the pathways with one finger. "The lost section here at the front, then reflection, then growth, and finally renewal at the back near the stream. You could walk your grief like a journey." That's what he wrote about. "A path through sorrow." Willa looked at Sterling with new understanding. "You've got your own grief to walk through, don't you?" Sterling didn't answer directly. "The work helps. I imagine it does." Willa studied the cleared section. "You know, I've got time on my hands these days. Retirement isn't quite what I expected. If you needed an extra pair of hands occasionally, I'm stronger than I look. I can't pay. Did I ask for payment? I'm offering to help restore something that mattered to this community. And maybe," she paused, "maybe I've got some walking to do myself. Lost my husband 2 years ago, Harold, 41 years together." Sterling understood immediately. "Tomorrow morning? I usually start around 7. "I'll bring coffee," Willa said. She kept her word. The next morning, Willa appeared with a thermos and 2 cups. They worked side by side, clearing the entrance pathway, and Sterling found himself grateful for the company. Willa told him stories about the area, about Aldrich's reputation as a recluse, who was actually just a very private, very sad man. "People feared him because he chose isolation," Willa said, pulling at a stubborn vine. "But the few who knew him said he was kind. Just broken. Some things break people in ways they never recover from." "But he did recover," Sterling said, "in his way. He built this. Did he? Or did he just find a way to live with being broken?" Willa sat back on her heels. "Maybe that's what recovery really is. Not becoming unbroken, but learning to build something meaningful anyway." Her words stayed with Sterling as they worked. He thought about his own brokenness, the failed marriage, the lost career, the relationship with his children reduced to awkward phone calls. He wasn't going to wake up one day and find those wounds healed. But maybe, like Aldrich, he could build something that mattered anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, Willa became a regular presence. She brought supplies sometimes, work gloves, hand tools, sandwiches for lunch. She also brought a practical knowledge of plants that Sterling lacked. She identified the survivors from Aldrich's original plantings, rare varieties that had gone wild but could be reclaimed. "This is heritage bleeding heart," she said, carefully digging around a clump of plants in the reflection section. "Aldrich must have special ordered these. You don't see this variety anymore." Sterling consulted Aldrich's journal. Sure enough, Aldrich had written extensively about the bleeding heart, how its heart-shaped flowers represented sorrow that blooms and fades, teaching us that grief comes in cycles. "We should propagate these," Willa said. "Divide them, spread them through the garden like Aldrich intended." They worked together in comfortable silence, and Sterling realized how much he'd missed simple human connection. Not forced conversation or therapy sessions, just two people working toward something good. One evening, as they packed up tools, Willa asked the question Sterling had been avoiding. "You have family, kids?" "Two, adults now. They're with their mother." Willa heard what he didn't say. "They know where you are. They know I bought some land. They don't know about—" He gestured at the garden. "This. Maybe they should," Willa said gently. "Maybe they need to see what you're building." Sterling didn't answer, but the seed was planted. That night, reading Aldrich's journals by lantern light, he came across an entry that stopped him. "Isolation protects us from further pain, but it also prevents healing. I chose this solitary work because I feared connection. But a garden only matters if someone walks through it." Sterling closed the journal and looked out at the darkness beyond his tent. Aldrich had spent 28 years building something beautiful in isolation. He died alone, his work forgotten until Sterling stumbled upon it. Sterling didn't want that ending. He pulled out his phone, stared at the blank text message screen, and finally typed, "I'm working on something I'd like to show you both. When you're ready." He sent it before he could reconsider. Then he returned to Aldrich's journals, reading by the warm glow of lantern light, learning from a man who'd walked this path before him. Sterling was working on the reflection section when he made the discovery. This quadrant, according to Aldrich's design, was meant to be a space of quiet contemplation, wider pathways, benches positioned to catch morning light, plantings that encouraged stillness rather than movement. He'd been clearing around what he thought was just another decorative stone when his shovel struck something that rang hollow. Sterling knelt and brushed away the dirt. Not a stone, a wooden box, partially rotted but still intact enough to hold its contents. Inside were pressed flowers, hundreds of them, each one carefully mounted on thick paper and labeled in Aldrich's precise handwriting. "Forget-me-not, for memories that refuse to fade. White, lily, for the purity of love that transcends death. Purple columbine, for the courage to face another day." Each specimen had notes about its symbolic meaning, its growing requirements, and where Aldrich had planted it in the garden. Some entries included personal reflections. Next to a pressed rose, Aldrich had written, "My son gave his mother roses every birthday. I cannot grow roses without weeping. But I grow them anyway, because some pain is worth keeping." Sterling sat among the cleared pathways, reading through Aldrich's flower collection, and felt the weight of another man's sorrow pressing against his own. These weren't just botanical specimens, they were physical manifestations of grief, each flower chosen deliberately to represent something Aldrich couldn't put into words. He carefully repacked the collection and brought it back to his tent. That evening, he cross-referenced the pressed flowers with Aldrich's garden map. Every plant in the original design had meaning, had purpose. The garden wasn't just beautiful. It was a language of loss and recovery, spelled out in living things. The next morning, a different visitor arrived. Sterling was surprised to see a man in his 60s climbing out of a pickup truck near the entrance. The truck bed was loaded with bags of soil amendment and what looked like landscaping supplies. "You the fellow restoring the Crow place?" the man called out. "Sterling Vaughan." He walked over, wiping his hands. "Floyd Kendrick." "I run Kendrick Hardware in town." Floyd looked around at the cleared sections with an appraising eye. "Willa Brennan mentioned you were doing serious work out here. Thought you might need some supplies." "I appreciate it, but I'm running pretty thin on funds." Floyd waved him off. Not asking for payment right now. Consider it an investment in the community. This place used to mean something around here before it got left to rot. If you're serious about bringing it back, I'm willing to help. Sterling felt something loosen in his chest. That's generous. It's practical, Floyd said, though his gruff tone didn't quite hide the sentiment underneath. Place like this, restored proper, could be good for Ridgemont. Besides, I knew Aldrich a bit. He bought supplies from my father's store, back when I was running the register as a kid. Strange man, but there was something about him, a sadness that made you want to help even if he never asked. They spent the morning discussing Sterling's plans. Floyd's practical knowledge complemented Willa's botanical expertise. He pointed out drainage issues Sterling had missed, suggested better tools for the work ahead, and offered observations about the property's infrastructure that only decades of hardware experience could provide. "You're living in a tent?" Floyd asked, noticing Sterling's camp setup. "For now. Winter's coming in a few months. You thought about that?" Sterling hadn't, not really. He'd been focused on the immediate work, not the long term. "I'll figure something out," Floyd grunted. "There's a storage shed on the back of my property. Insulated, wired for electricity. Built it for my son, but he moved to Portland 5 years ago. You can use it if you need. Better than freezing in canvas. I can't. You can, and you will if you've got any sense." Floyd's tone brooked no argument. Man's got to survive the winter if he's going to finish what he started. After Floyd left, Sterling returned to work with renewed energy. But the reality Floyd had pointed out gnawed at him. His savings were almost gone. He'd been avoiding the calculation, but the numbers were stark. Another month, maybe 2, and he'd have nothing left. That night, he did something he hadn't done in months. He opened his laptop, one of the few possessions he'd kept from his old life, and looked at job listings. Architecture firms, design companies, anything that might use his skills. The postings all wanted younger candidates, people with recent experience, portfolios that reflected current trends. Sterling's portfolio was 15 years of mid-range commercial projects. Competent work, nothing spectacular, certainly nothing that would make him stand out in a market flooded with younger, cheaper, more current architects. He closed the laptop and picked up Aldrich's journals instead. The botanist had faced similar financial pressures. One entry from 1965 read, "Spent the last of the insurance money today on stone for the renewal section. I should be worried. I should be planning for practical matters. But all I can think is, the garden needs this. I need this. Survival isn't just about money. It's about having something worth surviving for." Aldrich had made his choice. Sterling was making his. The work continued. With Willa's regular help and Floyd's supplies, progress accelerated. The lost section took shape, its narrow pathways and dark plantings creating the sense of confinement Aldrich had intended. Sterling and Willa worked to propagate the surviving heritage plants, dividing them and replanting them according to the original design. "You've got a feel for this," Willa said one afternoon, watching Sterling place stones for a rebuilt retaining wall. "The way you understand space and structure, that's not something you can teach." "I was an architect," Sterling said. "Before. And now." He looked around at the garden, taking shape around them. "Now I'm this, I guess," Willa smiled. "There are worse things to be." As weeks passed, Sterling noticed changes in himself beyond the physical. His hands were permanently callous now, his skin weathered by constant outdoor work. But it was more than that. The desperate, frantic feeling that had driven him to buy this property in the first place had eased into something steadier. Not happiness exactly, but purpose. He'd started his own journal, documenting the restoration work. At first, it was just practical notes, what sections he'd cleared, what plantings he'd restored. But gradually, his entries became more reflective, echoing Aldrich's style. He wrote about what he was learning from the work, from the garden, from his own grief. One entry read, "Today I rebuilt the stone bench in the reflection section." Aldrich's design placed it to catch the morning light. Sitting there, watching the sun come up through the trees, I thought about all the mornings I missed when I was married. Always rushing, always focused on work or problems or the next thing. I missed the mornings. Maybe that's what this garden is teaching me. Not to recover what was lost, but to pay attention to what remains. He thought about sending another message to his children, but decided to wait. The garden wasn't ready yet. He wasn't ready yet. But the fact that he was thinking about it, planning for connection rather than avoiding it, that was progress. Late one evening, Sterling discovered something else in Aldrich's pressed flower collection. Tucked between 2 pages was a small photograph so faded he almost missed it. It showed a younger Aldrich standing in the completed garden, and beside him, barely visible, was a woman. The back of the photo read, June 1985, 2 years after she left. 2 years after she came back. Some endings aren't permanent. Sterling stared at that photograph for a long time. Aldrich's wife had returned. The journals had made it sound like the separation was final, but this suggested otherwise. There was more to the story, and Sterling intended to find it in the remaining journals he hadn't yet read. 4 months into the restoration, Sterling stood at the threshold between the reflection and growth sections. Behind him lay the work he'd completed. Pathways cleared and rebuilt, plantings restored, the narrow confines of loss giving way to the more open spaces of reflection. Ahead lay the growth section, where Aldrich's design became more expansive, more hopeful. The stone bench with its carved inscription sat at the exact dividing line. Sterling had discovered it 2 weeks ago, buried under a collapsed trellis and years of accumulated debris. The inscription read, "In grief we plant, in time we harvest peace." He'd spent days carefully cleaning the bench, repairing the cracked armrest, resetting it on its original foundation. Now it served as his meditation spot, the place he came each morning before starting work and each evening after finishing. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Sterling almost ignored it. He'd grown used to silence out here, but something made him check. A text from Brooke. "Kent and I have been talking. We'd like to come see what you're doing. This weekend?" Sterling's chest tightened. This weekend, 3 days away. He looked around at the property with fresh eyes, trying to see it as his children would. The restored sections were impressive, but so much remained wild and overgrown. Would they understand what he was building here? Would they see purpose or just their father's latest retreat from reality? He typed back, "Yes, Saturday afternoon." The response came quickly. "See you then." Sterling spent the next 3 days in a frenzy of preparation. He cleared the main pathways with extra care, making sure nothing would trip visitors. He set up a simple seating area near the entrance with camp chairs and a cooler. He even drove into town and bought fresh clothes that didn't smell like earth and sweat. Willa found him Friday evening, practically vibrating with nervous energy as he rearranged stones for the 3rd time. "They're your children," she said gently. "Not the board of directors. I haven't seen them since the divorce was finalized. 9 months. Then they're coming because they want to see you, not because they want to judge your landscaping." Sterling knew she was right, but the anxiety remained. Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, cool and clear, the kind of day that made the garden look its absolute best. Sterling was at the entrance an hour early, then an hour and a half. Finally, he heard a car coming up the drive. Brooke emerged first from the driver's seat. 22 years old, she had her mother's features, but Sterling's dark hair. Kent followed, taller and more reserved, 24 and careful in the way Sterling remembered being at that age. "Dad," Brooke said, and Sterling heard the question in her voice. "Are you okay? Are you really living out here?" "Thank you for coming," he said, and then they were hugging, awkwardly at first, then with genuine feeling. Kent shook his hand. "You look different. Probably the beard." Sterling had stopped shaving weeks ago. "Not just that. You look, I don't know, healthier maybe?" They stood in uncertain silence for a moment until Sterling gestured toward the pathways. "Would you like to see what I've been working on?" He led them through the entrance, watching their faces as they took in the restored loss section. The narrow pathways, the dark plantings beginning to establish themselves, the stone archways marking the journey inward. "This is incredible," Brooke said, running her hand along a carefully fitted stone wall. "You built all this?" Most of it was already here. I'm restoring it. Sterling explained about Aldrich Crow, about finding the journals, about the garden's original purpose as a place to walk through grief. They moved through to the reflection section, and Sterling showed them the bench with its inscription. Kent read it aloud, then looked at his father with new understanding. "This is what you've been doing all these months. Working with my hands helps me think," Sterling said. "And this place, it needed someone to care for it again." Brooke touched the pressed flower collection Sterling had brought out to show them. She read through Aldrich's notes about symbolic meanings, about building beauty from sorrow. "Dad, this is beautiful. The whole thing. I had no idea. Neither did I when I bought the property. I just needed somewhere quiet. Mom said you'd given up," Kent said quietly. "That you'd bought some abandoned land and were camping out like you were waiting to disappear." Sterling absorbed that. "Maybe that's what I was doing at first. But then I found Aldrich's work and I realized disappearing isn't the same as starting over." They spent 2 hours walking the property. Sterling showed them the sections still to be restored, explained Aldrich's design philosophy, shared entries from the journals that had resonated with him. His children asked questions, real questions, about the work and the plans and what Sterling intended to do long-term. "I don't know yet," he admitted when Kent asked about his future. "Right now, I'm focused on finishing what Aldrich started. Beyond that, I'm taking it one day at a time." They worked together for a while, clearing brush from the growth section. Sterling showed them how to identify the heritage plantings, how to work around the established root systems. The physical labor gave them something to do besides talk, and paradoxically, it made conversation easier. "I'm sorry I wasn't there more," Sterling said as they worked. "Before, when you were growing up. I thought providing was the same as being present." Brooke paused in her work. "You were there, Dad. Maybe not as much as we wanted, but you were there. Your mother was right to leave me," Sterling continued. "I was so focused on work, on proving something, I forgot what actually mattered." "She wasn't right about everything," Kent said. "She made it sound like you were choosing work over family. But I think, looking back, you were just trying to take care of us the only way you knew how." They ate the lunch Brooke had brought, sitting on the stone bench while Sterling told them more about Aldrich's story. He showed them the photograph he'd found, the one with Aldrich's wife, taken years after she'd left. "He got her back?" Brooke asked. "I don't know the whole story yet. There are journals I haven't read, but it looks like some endings aren't as final as they seem." Kent met his father's eyes. "Is that what you're hoping for? With Mom?" Sterling considered the question honestly. "No, what your mother and I had, it's over, and maybe it needed to be. But this," he gestured at the garden, "this is teaching me that something can end and still lead to something worthwhile. I'm not trying to get back what I lost. I'm trying to build something new from what remains." They stayed until late afternoon. Before leaving, Brooke hugged her father tightly. "We'll come back, if that's okay. I'd like that. And Dad, maybe stop avoiding Mom's calls. She's been worried, even if she won't admit it." After they left, Sterling sat on the stone bench and watched the sun angle through the trees. The visit hadn't erased 9 months of distance, but it was a beginning. His children had seen what he was building, and more importantly, they'd seemed to understand why it mattered. That evening, he opened one of Aldrich's later journals, looking for the rest of the story about the reconciliation. What he found was an entry from 1983. "June returned today, 26 years after she left. We are both different people now, shaped by time and separate sorrows." She asked if I was still angry. I showed her the garden instead. "Some questions are better answered with what we've built than with what we say." Sterling understood exactly what Aldrich meant. Words could explain, but the garden showed what happened when you took grief and transformed it into purpose. That truth was worth more than any explanation. He picked up his own journal and wrote, "My children came today. They saw the work. They saw me. For the first time in a long time, I think they saw me as I actually am, not as the father who was always working or the man who fell apart. Maybe that's progress. Maybe that's enough for now." Sterling discovered the seed vault on a morning when frost first touched the ground. He'd been working in the growth section, following Aldrich's map to locate the original planting beds when his shovel struck something solid beneath the soil. It took an hour to excavate carefully around the object. A metal box, about 2 feet square, sealed with wax around the edges. The preservation was deliberate, meticulous. Sterling carried it back to his camp and spent another hour carefully removing the seal without damaging whatever lay inside. Seeds. Hundreds of packets of seeds, each one labeled in Aldrich's handwriting with variety names, dates collected, and growing instructions. But these weren't ordinary seeds. As Sterling read through the labels, he realized what he'd found: heritage varieties, some of them likely extinct in commercial cultivation. Aldrich had been preserving rare plants, saving them from disappearing entirely. One packet was labeled Thomas Jefferson Runnerbean, 1790 heirloom, last known cultivation 1965. Another read Moon and Stars Watermelon pre-1900, and thought extinct. Aldrich had notes with each packet, saved from Mrs. Henderson's garden before she passed. Last person in county growing these. Sterling handled the packets with reverence. This wasn't just a seed collection, it was a genetic library, a preservation of living history. Aldrich had been saving more than his own grief. He'd been saving pieces of the past itself. He showed the collection to Willa the next day. Her reaction confirmed his suspicion. "Lord have mercy," she breathed, carefully examining the packets. "Some of these varieties, sterling, these could be worth a fortune to seed preservation societies. But more than that, they're irreplaceable. If these seeds are still viable, Aldrich saved things that would otherwise be gone forever. What do I do with them?" Willa looked at him seriously. "You plant them. That's what he saved them for. Not to sit in a box, but to grow again." They decided to start a demonstration garden in the growth section, a place where Aldrich's preserved varieties could be cultivated and shared. Sterling built raised beds using reclaimed stone, following Aldrich's notes about proper spacing and companion planting. Word of the restoration had been spreading quietly through Ridgemont. Floyd had mentioned it to customers at the hardware store. Willa had told her former teaching colleagues. People were curious about the abandoned property coming back to life. The first stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning. Sterling looked up from his work to see a woman in her mid-50s standing uncertainly at the garden entrance. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said. "Willa Brennan told me about this place. She said it was a garden for people who were grieving." Sterling set down his tools and walked over. "It was originally. I'm working to restore it. My husband died 4 months ago." The woman's voice was steady, but her eyes held the glazed look of recent loss. "Heart attack. He was 56. Everyone keeps telling me I need to move on, get back to normal, but I don't know how to do that. I'm Sterling." He offered his hand. "Mirabel Torres." Sterling showed her the garden, explaining Aldrich's design, the journey through loss, reflection, growth, and renewal. He didn't offer platitudes or advice. He just walked the paths with her, let her see what one grieving man had built from his sorrow. "Could I come back?" Mirabel asked as they returned to the entrance. "Maybe help with some of the work. I need something to do with my hands. Tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. Bring gloves." Mirabel returned the next day, and the day after that. She worked quietly, asking few questions, but Sterling noticed the tension in her shoulders gradually easing as her hands found rhythm in the work. Physical labor offered what words couldn't, a place to put the restless energy of grief. 2 weeks later, another visitor arrived. A man in his late 60s, military bearings still evident in his posture, despite the tremor in his hands. "Name's Hugh Dalworth," he said. "Retired Army. Someone told me this was a quiet place." Sterling recognized the look, the hypervigilance, the careful scanning of surroundings. "It's quiet," he confirmed. "Peaceful too, if you're looking for that." Hugh walked the garden paths like he was on patrol, but gradually Sterling saw him relax. The man's hands stopped shaking when he was pulling weeds or moving stones. He returned the next day without being invited, and the day after that. By late October, Sterling had 7 regular volunteers. They came for different reasons: grief, trauma, loneliness, or simple curiosity, but they all stayed for the same thing: The garden offered something the modern world struggled to provide: purposeful work, quiet connection, and space to heal at your own pace. Sterling found himself in an unexpected role. He wasn't a therapist or a counselor, but somehow he'd become a guide for people walking their own path through sorrow. He shared Aldrich's journals with them, let them read about someone else who'd survived devastating loss. He showed them the pressed flowers, the seed collection, the evidence that grief could be transformed into something generative. The volunteers brought supplies, coffee, lunch, tools they weren't using. They brought skills too. Hugh knew irrigation systems from his military engineering background. Mirabelle had grown up on a farm and understood soil composition. Others contributed what they could, and the restoration accelerated. Floyd stopped by one afternoon to find 8 people working throughout the property. "You've started something here," he observed. "I'm just restoring Aldrich's garden." "No, you're doing what Aldrich did, building a place for broken people to put themselves back together." Floyd looked around at the volunteers scattered through the work site. Town could use more of this. That evening, Sterling sat at the stone bench and tried to process what was happening. He'd come here to hide, to lick his wounds in private. Instead, he'd stumbled into something larger than his own grief. The garden was becoming what Aldrich had intended, a sanctuary for people who needed it. He opened Aldrich's journals to a passage he'd marked earlier. "I thought I was building this garden for myself, as a way to survive my own sorrow. But I'm beginning to understand. We never grieve alone, even when we think we do. Sorrow is the most universal human experience. What we build from it should be available to others, walking the same path." Sterling's phone buzzed. A text from Kent. "Brooke and I were talking. What you're doing out there, it matters, Dad. We're proud of you." He stared at those words for a long time. Proud. When was the last time his children had said that? When was the last time he'd done something worthy of pride? He wrote back, "Thank you. That means more than you know." Another message appeared, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "Hi, this is Mirabelle. I hope it's okay to text. I wanted you to know, today was the first day since my husband died that I didn't cry. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I wanted to tell someone who might understand." Sterling replied, "It's good. It means you're finding your way through. See you tomorrow." He added another entry to his own journal. "Aldrich built this garden to save himself, but it ended up saving others too. I'm beginning to understand that maybe that's the point of surviving grief, not just to get through it yourself, but to build something that helps the next person find their way. Legacy isn't what we leave behind when we die. It's what we build while we're living that continues to matter after we're gone." The temperature was dropping, frost settling over the cleared sections. Winter was coming, but Sterling looked at what they'd accomplished. 3 sections nearly complete, a community of healers working together, rare seeds planted and already germinating, and felt ready to face whatever came next. He'd survived the dissolution of his old life. Now he was building a new one, and it was bigger than he'd ever imagined it could be. Sterling found the final journal volume in late November, tucked in a corner of the vault he'd somehow missed during his initial discovery. The leather was darker than the others, more worn, as if Aldrich had handled this one more frequently. The dates on the spine read 1985-1987. He carried it back to Floyd's storage shed, his home now for the past month. The small structure had heat, electricity, and enough space for a bed and a desk. Floyd had refused any rent, saying only that empty buildings deteriorated faster than occupied ones. Sterling made coffee and settled in to read. The early entries were mundane, notes about plantings, weather observations, routine maintenance. But halfway through 1985, the tone shifted dramatically. June returned today. I opened the door, and there she stood, 26 years older, but unmistakably the woman I married. She said, "I hear you built a garden." I said, "I built a life." We stood there looking at each other, and I realized I'm not angry anymore. Somewhere in these 26 years, I let go of the bitterness. Maybe that's what the garden was really for. Sterling read faster, following Aldrich's cautious reconnection with his ex-wife. They walked the garden paths together. They talked about their son, about the years apart, about how grief had shaped them both differently. June had remarried briefly, divorced again, raised no other children. Aldrich had buried himself in his garden project. "She understands what I built here," Aldrich wrote. "Not just the physical garden, but the purpose behind it. She asked if I built it to forget our son. I told her no. I built it to remember him properly, to transform the pain of his loss into something that might help others." She cried then, and said that's what she'd been trying to do all these years too, just in different ways. The entries chronicled their reconciliation. June moved back in, not as his wife, but as his companion. They worked the garden together. She brought her own ideas, her own grief, her own need for beauty and purpose. Sterling turned the page and found something that made him stop breathing. A sealed envelope tucked between journal pages, addressed in Aldrich's shaking handwriting, "To whoever finds this garden again." His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper inside was yellowed, but the ink remained clear. "If you're reading this, you've discovered the vault and the journals. You've learned about my grief, my garden, my attempt to build meaning from loss. But there's more you need to know. In 1986, I contacted the county about establishing this property as a public trust. I wanted the garden to continue after my death, to remain a sanctuary for grieving people who needed it. I filled out the paperwork, drafted the trust documents, even found a lawyer willing to help pro bono. But the process was complicated. The county required surveys, environmental assessments, public hearings. I was 70 years old, sick with the cancer that would eventually kill me, and the bureaucracy seemed designed to outlast my remaining time. I want whoever reads this to know, I tried to secure the garden's future. But I died before the trust could be properly established. The paperwork exists somewhere in county records, incomplete and unsigned. My lawyer died the year after I did. The whole effort was forgotten. My only living relative is my brother's grandson, a boy who never met me, never knew what I built here. His name is Garrett Hollis. If he inherits this property, he won't understand what it means. He'll see 5 acres of overgrown land with commercial potential. So this is my message to the future. If you've found this place, if you've worked to restore it, if you understand what I was trying to build, please finish what I started. Complete the trust. Make this garden permanent. Don't let my life's work be bulldozed for strip malls or housing developments. The garden belongs to everyone who needs it. That was always the point. Aldrich Crow, written October 15th, 1987, 3 weeks before my death. Sterling read the letter 3 times, his heart pounding. Aldrich had tried to protect the garden. The legal framework existed, just never completed, which meant his phone rang. An unknown number. Sterling almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Sterling Vaughan?" A man's voice, professional and slightly impatient. "Yes, my name is Garrett Hollis. I believe you're currently occupying property that belongs to my family." Sterling's stomach dropped. "I bought this property legally through Morrison Real Estate. You bought it from a speculator who acquired it through a tax sale. But there's a problem with the title. My great-uncle Aldrich Crow was the original owner. When he died, the property should have passed to family, but there were complications with the probate. I've been reviewing the records, and I have grounds to contest your ownership. Mr. Hollis, I've invested months of work. I'm not interested in your work. I'm interested in property rights. I'm informing you as a courtesy that I'll be filing a claim. I suggest you consult a lawyer." The line went dead. Sterling sat in stunned silence, Aldrich's letter still in his hand. Everything he'd built, everything the garden had become, it could all disappear. Garrett Hollis had no connection to this place, no understanding of what it meant. He'd see only the commercial value of 5 acres near town. He called Willa first. She answered on the second ring. "We have a problem," Sterling said, and explained about Garrett's call and Aldrich's letter. "That bastard," Willa said, her normally gentle voice sharp with anger. "Garrett Hollis? I remember him vaguely. Came through town once or twice when Aldrich was still alive. Never visited his great-uncle, never showed any interest. Now he wants to claim the property. He says he has legal grounds. Then we need to fight him. "Sterling, what you've built here, what Aldrich built, it matters too much to let some distant relative destroy it for money." Sterling looked around the storage shed at his few possessions. He had no savings left, no resources for a legal battle. "I don't know how to fight this. You finish what Aldrich started. You complete that trust formation. We get the community involved. We show the county what this place has become. We prove that Aldrich's original intent should be honored." After they hung up, Sterling sat with Aldrich's letter and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just fighting for his own work anymore. He was fighting for Aldrich's legacy, for the volunteers who'd found healing here, for everyone who might need this garden in the future. He opened his laptop and began researching trust formation, property law, and public land dedication. The legal language was dense and complicated, but Sterling had spent 15 years reading architectural codes and zoning regulations. He knew how to navigate bureaucratic systems. By morning he had a plan. It was fragile and dependent on factors beyond his control, but it was something. He'd document everything, the restoration work, the community involvement, Aldrich's clear intent to create a public sanctuary. He'd find that incomplete trust paperwork in county records. He'd prove that honoring Aldrich's wishes mattered more than Garrett's property claim. The garden was worth fighting for. Sterling was finally, after months of grief and rebuilding, ready to fight. Sterling spent the next 3 days buried in county records. The clerk's office in Ridgemont had filing cabinets dating back to the 1950s, and somewhere in those drawers was Aldrich's incomplete trust documentation. He found it on the 4th day, misfiled under Crow instead of Crow. 3 manila folders containing surveys, environmental assessments, and a partially completed trust formation document. Aldrich had gotten further than Sterling expected. The groundwork was there. It just needed someone to finish it. Sterling photographed every page, then consulted with a retired lawyer Willa knew, a woman named Patricia Colby, who'd handled land trusts before. She reviewed the documents in her small home office while Sterling sat across from her, trying not to appear as desperate as he felt. "This is good work," Patricia finally said. "Aldrich knew what he was doing. The problem is, it was never filed with the state, never finalized with proper signatures. Legally, it's just an expression of intent. Can we finish it now? Possibly. But you'd need to prove several things. That completing the trust honors the deceased's clear wishes, that the property serves a legitimate public purpose, and that you have community support." She looked at Sterling over her reading glasses. "And you'd need to do all this before Garrett Hollis's claim is heard by the county, which, according to the notice you showed me, is in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Sterling felt the timeline pressing against him like a physical weight. Patricia continued, "Your strongest argument is demonstrating community benefit. If you can show that the property functions as Aldrich intended, as a public healing space, and that multiple people rely on it, the county might rule that honoring his intent serves the greater good." Sterling left her office with a plan forming. He needed to document everything, the volunteers, their stories, the garden's impact. He needed to make the county understand what would be lost if Garrett's claim succeeded. That evening, he called a meeting at the garden. 23 people showed up, all the regular volunteers, plus others who'd heard about the situation through Ridgemont's efficient gossip network. They gathered in the reflection section, sitting on stones and benches as twilight settled over the property. Sterling explained the situation clearly. Garrett's claim, the incomplete trust, the upcoming county hearing. "I need your help," he said. "Not just with the work, but with testimony. The county needs to hear what this place means, how it's helped people. They need to understand that Aldrich's vision wasn't just about pretty gardens. It was about creating something that serves the community." Mirabelle spoke first. "I'll testify. This garden, Sterling, it saved me. After my husband died, I didn't know how to keep living. Working here, being around other people who understood grief, it gave me a reason to get up in the morning." Hugh stood, his military bearing evident. "I've got PTSD from 2 tours in Afghanistan. Tried therapy, medication, support groups. Nothing worked like this place. Something about putting your hands in soil, building something growing. It quiets the noise in my head. I'll tell the county that. Others shared similar stories. A woman who'd lost her daughter to cancer. A man recovering from addiction who found purpose in the physical work. A couple rebuilding their marriage after betrayal who discovered that working together in the garden helped them communicate. Sterling listened to each story, feeling the weight of what he'd accidentally created. He'd thought he was just restoring an old garden. Instead, he'd become the steward of something that genuinely mattered to people's survival. "We need to show them," Willa said. "Not just tell them, but show them what we've built here. Invite the county board members to visit before the hearing. Let them walk the paths, see the work, meet the volunteers." They spent the next 2 weeks in focused preparation. Sterling drafted a formal presentation, gathering photographs of the restoration process, before and after images that documented the transformation. He compiled excerpts from Aldrich's journals that clearly stated his intent to create a public sanctuary. The volunteers worked with renewed intensity, completing the growth section and beginning the renewal quadrant. They built a memorial wall where people could place stones inscribed with names of loved ones they'd lost. They planted the heritage seeds from Aldrich's collection in demonstration beds, with plaques explaining the preservation effort. Floyd organized a fundraising effort for legal fees and trust establishment costs. He put donation jars at his hardware store and other local businesses. The community responded with surprising generosity, small donations mostly, but they added up. People wanted to help protect the garden. Kent and Brooke drove up one weekend to support their father. They worked alongside the volunteers, and Sterling saw them truly understand what he'd built. Not just a garden, but a community. "You found your purpose," Brooke said, as they worked together moving stones for the memorial wall. "I was worried about you after the divorce, but Dad, this is important work. I stumbled into it accidentally. Maybe that's how the best things happen. You were looking for a place to hide, and instead you found a place where other people needed to heal too." The county board members' visit happened 1 week before the hearing. 4 of them came. 2 women and 2 men, all wearing the slightly skeptical expressions of public officials who'd seen too many questionable projects. Sterling led them through the garden, explaining Aldrich's design philosophy and showing them the restoration work. He introduced them to volunteers who shared brief, honest testimonies about what the place meant to them. He showed them the heritage seed collection and explained the preservation effort. The board members asked practical questions about maintenance costs, liability insurance, long-term sustainability. Sterling had answers. The volunteers provided labor, donations covered materials. Patricia had found a model for liability protection used by other public gardens. At the stone bench in the reflection section, one board member, a woman named Alice Chen, sat down and read the inscription aloud. "In grief we plant, in time we harvest peace." She looked up at Sterling. "Your Mr. Crow was quite the philosopher. He was just a man who survived terrible loss and tried to make something meaningful from it. Aren't we all?" Alice said quietly. And Sterling saw recognition in her eyes. She understood. She'd walked this path herself. After the board members left, Sterling felt cautiously hopeful. They'd seen the garden at its best, met people whose lives it had touched. But he wouldn't know if it was enough until the hearing. The night before the hearing, Sterling sat at the stone bench and wrote in his journal, "Aldrich spent 28 years building this place, then died trying to protect it. I've only been here 8 months, but I understand why it mattered so much to him. It's not about the plants or the stones. It's about creating space for people to transform their pain into something that grows. Tomorrow I'll fight to preserve that. Whatever happens, at least I tried to finish what he started." He looked up at the stars visible through the trees, at the garden shadows stretching in moonlight, and felt ready for whatever came next. The county hearing room was smaller than Sterling expected, folding chairs arranged in rows, a long table at the front where the board members sat, fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and official. Sterling arrived early with Patricia, Willa, and a core group of volunteers. The room gradually filled with supporters, maybe 40 people total, Garrett Hollis sat on the opposite side with his lawyer, a sharp-dressed man in his 30s who looked like he specialized in property disputes. Garrett himself was 55, balding, with the pinched expression of someone perpetually calculating value. He didn't acknowledge Sterling or anyone else, just reviewed papers with his lawyer. The board chair, Alice Chen, called the hearing to order. "We're here to consider two related matters, Mr. Hollis's claim of inheritance rights to the former Crow property and Mr. Vaughan's petition to complete the establishment of a public land trust on the same property. Mr. Hollis, your claim first." Garrett's lawyer stood. "Thank you. This is straightforward property law. Aldrich Crow died intestate in 1987. His closest living relative is my client, Garrett Hollis, his brother's grandson. The property should have passed to family through standard inheritance law. Due to administrative errors during probate, it was instead seized for tax default and sold through a series of transactions that lacked proper legal foundation. We're asking the board to acknowledge Mr. Hollis's rightful claim and void the subsequent sales, including Mr. Vaughan's purchase." The lawyer presented documentation, family trees, probate records, legal precedents. It was thorough and professionally done. Sterling felt his confidence waver as he listened to the technical arguments. When the lawyer finished, Alice looked at Sterling. "Mr. Vaughan, your response." Sterling stood, his throat dry. Patricia had prepared him, but actually speaking in front of the board felt different than rehearsing. "I don't dispute Mr. Hollis's family connection to Aldrich Crow, but I believe there's crucial context the board needs to understand about Aldrich's intentions for this property." He explained about finding the journals, about Aldrich's documented plan to establish a public trust, about the incomplete paperwork filed with the county in 1986. Aldrich Crow spent 28 years building that garden with a specific purpose, to create a sanctuary for people dealing with grief and loss. He tried to legally protect that purpose before he died. He failed only because the bureaucratic process outlasted his health. Sterling presented copies of Aldrich's letter, the trust documents, excerpts from the journals. "This isn't about my ownership rights versus Mr. Hollis's inheritance claim. This is about honoring what Aldrich actually wanted for his life's work." Alice studied the documents. "These trust papers were never finalized?" "No, ma'am, but Aldrich's intent is clear and documented. What I'm asking is that the board allow us to complete what he started, establish the public trust as he wished, ensuring the property serves the community purpose he designed it for." Garrett's lawyer objected. "Intent doesn't override property law. Mr. Crow's wishes, however admirable, don't change the legal reality that this property should pass to family." "Then let's discuss community impact," Patricia said, standing. "The board has discretion to consider public benefit in property disputes. We'd like to present testimony about what this garden has become." Alice nodded. "Proceed." Mirabelle spoke first, her voice steady despite obvious nerves. "My name is Mirabelle Torres. My husband died last spring. I was drowning in grief, couldn't function, couldn't see a reason to keep going. Someone told me about Mr. Vaughan's garden project. I started volunteering just to have something to do with my hands. That work, it saved my life. I'm not exaggerating. The garden gave me a reason to get up every morning, a place where my grief was understood without explanation. There are a dozen other people who tell you similar stories." Hugh testified next, about his PTSD, about years of failed treatments, about finding peace in the physical work of restoration. "That garden does what the VA couldn't do. It gives veterans a place to heal on our own terms." Others followed, each testimony brief but powerful. A woman whose teenage son had died described how working in the memorial section helped her process her loss. An elderly man talked about finding community after his wife's death left him isolated. The board listened carefully. Sterling watched their faces, trying to gauge reactions. Alice seemed moved. 2 other members took notes. The fourth, an older man, remained impassive, When the testimony's finished, Garrett's lawyer stood again. These stories are touching, but they don't change property rights. My client isn't obligated to continue his great-uncle's project, however worthy. He has his own financial needs and plans for the property. Alice looked at Garrett directly. Mr. Hollis, would you like to speak? Garrett stood, clearly uncomfortable with public speaking. I understand people have gotten attached to what's been done there, but I never knew my great-uncle. He never reached out to family, never invited us to visit. I'm struggling financially right now. I need to sell this property to cover debts. That's my right as the legal heir. What would you do with the land? Alice asked. Sell it to a developer. The location is good for residential housing or commercial use. Whatever brings the best return. Sterling saw several volunteers react, sharp intakes of breath, Willa shaking her head. The garden would be destroyed, bulldozed for whatever made the most money. Patricia stood. We have one final piece of evidence, documentation found in county records that we believe is crucial to this decision. She presented the file Sterling had discovered, Aldrich's correspondence with the county, dated from 1986, clearly expressing his desire to donate the land for public use. The final letter was particularly striking, written 3 weeks before Aldrich's death. Aldrich Crowe stated explicitly, Patricia read, that he hoped his garden would serve grieving people long after I'm gone, offering them what it offered me, a path through sorrow and a reason to keep living. That wasn't a casual wish. That was his express purpose for 30 years of work. Alice examined the letter carefully. The other board members leaned in to read over her shoulder. The room held its breath. We'll need to deliberate, Alice finally said. This is complex, competing. Legal claims, documented intent, community impact. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes with a decision. The board members filed out. Sterling sat down heavily, adrenaline leaving him shaky. Willa squeezed his shoulder. You did well. We all did. But Sterling knew it might not be enough. The law was on Garrett's side. All they had was Aldrich's unfulfilled wishes and 8 months of restoration work. Now they could only wait. The 30-minute deliberation stretched to 45. Sterling stood outside the hearing room with his supporters, too nervous to sit. Volunteers had brought something wrapped in cloth. When they unfolded it, Sterling saw a quilt made from fabric squares, each one decorated with names, dates, and brief messages. We made this last week, Willa explained. Every person who's worked in the garden contributed a patch. We were going to present it, but there wasn't time. Sterling examined the squares. In memory of Harold Brennan, 40 years of love, for my daughter Sarah, forever 16. Remembering James Torres, my heart. Each patch represented someone's loss, someone's grief given form and color. The quilt was beautiful and heartbreaking in equal measure. Whatever happens in there, Mirabelle said quietly, we built something that mattered. They can't take that away from us. The hearing room door opened. Alice beckoned them back inside. Sterling's heart hammered as everyone filed in and took their seats. The board members' faces revealed nothing. Alice spoke first. This has been a difficult decision. We've reviewed the legal arguments, the documentation, and the testimony. The law regarding property inheritance is clear. Mr. Hollis does have a legitimate claim as Aldrich Crowe's closest living relative. Sterling felt his stomach drop. Around him, volunteers shifted uncomfortably. However, Alice continued, we also have clear documentation of Aldrich Crowe's expressed intent to dedicate this property to public use. The trust formation he initiated in 1986, while incomplete, demonstrates serious effort to establish a legal framework for that dedication. The question before us is whether we prioritize strict inheritance law or honor the deceased's documented wishes, combined with demonstrated community benefit. She paused, looking directly at Garrett. Mr. Hollis, before we announce our decision, I'd like to ask you something. Have you visited the property? Seen what's been built there? Garrett shifted in his seat. No, I live 3 hours away. This has all been handled through my lawyer. Would you be willing to visit before we finalize anything? To actually see what your great-uncle created and what Mr. Vaughan has restored. Garrett's lawyer started to object, but Garrett waved him off. I suppose I could. Then here's what I propose, Alice said. We're going to table this decision for 1 week. Mr. Hollis will visit the property, not for legal inspection, but as Aldrich Crow's family member. He'll see the garden, meet the people it serves, and then we'll reconvene. At that time, we'll ask Mr. Hollis if his position remains unchanged. Garrett's lawyer stood immediately. With respect, my client's position is based on legal rights, not emotional appeals. I'll go, Garrett interrupted, his voice surprising everyone. I'll visit. Sterling blinked in confusion. This wasn't a victory, but it wasn't defeat either. It was, what? A reprieve, a chance? The hearing adjourned. Outside, Sterling tried to process what had happened. Patricia put a hand on his arm. That was unusual. Alice is giving Garrett a chance to see what he'd be destroying. It's not legally required, but it's strategic. If Garrett changes his position voluntarily, it simplifies everything. And if he doesn't, then we're back where we started. But Sterling, you made them pause. That's not nothing. Garrett approached before leaving, his lawyer trailing behind, looking annoyed. I'll come Saturday morning. 9 o'clock. I'll be there, Sterling said. Saturday arrived with cold, clear weather. Sterling had asked the volunteers to come, not to stage anything, just to work as they normally would. If Garrett was going to see the garden, he should see it as it actually was, full of people finding purpose in the work. Garrett arrived exactly at 9, alone. His lawyer's absence felt significant. He parked his sedan and stood looking at the entrance, clearly uncertain. Thank you for coming, Sterling said, walking over. The board seemed to think it was important. Garrett's tone was defensive, but his eyes were taking in the restored archways, the cleared pathways, the evidence of extensive work. Sterling led him through the garden sections, explaining Aldrich's design philosophy as they walked. He showed Garrett the lost section's narrow paths, the reflection area with its meditation bench, the growth section where heritage plants flourished in demonstration beds. Garrett said little, but Sterling saw him reading the inscription on the stone bench, pausing at the memorial wall to study the names carved on stones. When they reached the seed vault area, Sterling showed him the preserved varieties Aldrich had saved. He was trying to preserve things that would otherwise be lost, Sterling explained. Not just for himself, but for future generations. I never knew any of this. Garrett's voice was strained. My grandfather, Aldrich's brother, used to talk about him. Called him crazy, obsessed. Said he'd wasted his life hiding from the world after his son died. Maybe that's what your grandfather saw. But Aldrich wasn't hiding. He was building. They walked to the renewal section, where volunteers were working on the final quadrant. Mirabelle was there, and Hugh, and a dozen others. They nodded to Garrett, but didn't interrupt, just continued their work. Garrett watched them for a long moment. They really come here every week? Most of them come daily. The garden has become part of their healing process. And you don't charge them? Don't make money from this? No, that's not what it's for. Garrett was quiet as they completed the circuit and returned to the entrance. He looked around at everything again, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd expected. I need to tell you something, Garrett finally said, his voice breaking slightly. I'm not some heartless developer. I'm a high school music teacher. I have medical debt from my wife's cancer treatment. She survived, thank God, but we're buried financially. When I found out about this property, I saw a way to solve our problems. Sterling saw the man clearly for the first time. Not an antagonist, but another person struggling with his own burdens. My great-uncle tried to contact me once, Garrett continued. I was maybe 25, busy with my own life. He sent a letter inviting me to visit the garden. I never responded. I didn't think it mattered. Now I see, his voice caught. Now I see what I missed. What he was trying to share. It's not too late, Sterling said quietly. You could still be part of what he built. The trust needs board members, family representation. You could honor his memory by helping protect this place instead of selling it. Garrett stared at the garden, tears running down his face. I don't know if I can afford to make that choice. The volunteers have raised money for the trust formation. There's a fund growing for maintenance costs. If your need is financial, maybe we can find another way to help that doesn't require destroying what your great-uncle spent his life creating." Garrett wiped his eyes. "I need to think and talk to my wife. Take your time. The hearing isn't until next Saturday." After Garrett left, Willa approached Sterling. "That was well done. You gave him a way to change his mind without losing face. I just showed him what Aldrich built and told him the truth. We can find solutions that don't require tearing this down." Sterling sat on the stone bench and looked at the volunteers working throughout the property. Whatever the board decided, whatever Garrett chose, this moment existed. The garden was alive again, serving the purpose Aldrich had envisioned. That truth couldn't be taken away, regardless of what happened next. The final hearing was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, but Garrett called Sterling on Thursday evening. "I've made my decision," he said without preamble. "I'd like to meet with you and your lawyer tomorrow morning, if possible." "At the garden." Sterling's heart raced. "Of course. What time?" 8 o'clock. "I'm bringing my wife Helen. She wants to see the place too." Friday morning arrived cold and bright. Sterling was at the garden by 7, nervously checking pathways, though there was nothing to check. The work spoke for itself. Garrett and Helen arrived precisely at 8. Helen was a thin woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a scarf covering her head. Hair still growing back after chemotherapy, Sterling guessed. She looked around with immediate wonder. Garrett described it, but I didn't imagine. She walked to the nearest archway and ran her hand along the stone. "This is extraordinary." Patricia arrived moments later. They gathered at the stone bench in the reflection section, the morning sun slanting through bare tree branches. Garrett spoke first. "Helen and I talked for hours after I visited. About my great-uncle, about what he tried to build here, about my own regrets for never knowing him. We also talked about our financial situation and what matters most." He paused, looking at his wife. Helen took his hand. "We've been so focused on paying off medical debt that we lost sight of other kinds of wealth. When Garrett told me about this garden, about what it means to people, I realized we were about to destroy something irreplaceable for money we'd eventually earn anyway. We can't afford to just walk away from the inheritance claim." Garrett continued. "But we don't want to sell the property to developers either, so we'd like to propose something." He pulled out a folder. "We're willing to withdraw our ownership claim on the condition that the public trust is established as Aldrich intended. But we'd like 2 things in return. First, that I'm appointed to the Trust's board of directors, representing family interests. Second, that the Trust makes a payment to us, not market value, but enough to make a meaningful dent in our medical debt. Whatever amount the fundraising and community support can reasonably provide." Sterling looked at Patricia, who was reading through Garrett's proposal. She nodded slightly. "This could work. The trust formation allows for reasonable compensation to heirs who voluntarily surrender property claims. If the community can raise the funds, this gives everyone what they need." "How much are you asking?" Sterling asked. Garrett named a figure, substantial but not unreasonable, less than 1/10 of what the property would bring from developers. "We're not trying to profit," he said. "Just trying to survive our circumstances while doing the right thing." Sterling thought about the fundraising Floyd had organized, the donations that had been steadily accumulating. The amount Garrett named was achievable with community support. "I think we can make this work." Helen spoke again, her voice emotional. "Garrett's grandfather was wrong about Aldrich. He wasn't crazy or wasted. He was brave. He took unbearable pain and transformed it into something that helps others. That's not hiding from life. That's embracing what life can be, even at its darkest." She looked at Sterling. "What you've done, continuing his work, that's brave too." The final hearing that afternoon was brief. Garrett presented the settlement proposal. Sterling and Patricia confirmed their agreement. The board members, visibly relieved to avoid a contentious decision, approved the arrangement unanimously. Ellis Chen smiled as she signed the paperwork. This is how these things should work. Competing interests finding common ground through understanding and compromise. The Aldrich Crowe Memorial Garden will be established as a public trust, with Sterling Vaughan as primary steward and Garrett Hollis as family representative on the board. Mr. Hollis will receive agreed-upon compensation from the trust fund. The property is permanently protected for its intended purpose. Outside the hearing room, volunteers who'd gathered to support Sterling erupted in celebration. Willa hugged him fiercely. Floyd clapped him on the back hard enough to hurt. Mirabelle was crying, and Hugh, stoic, careful Hugh, was grinning broadly. Kent and Brooke had driven up for the hearing. They stood with their father as the crowd celebrated around them. "You did it, Dad," Brooke said. "You actually did it." "We did it," Sterling corrected. "All of us together." 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, the Aldrich Crowe Memorial Garden held its official opening ceremony. The restoration was complete. All 4 sections fully realized according to Aldrich's original design. The heritage seeds had grown into thriving plants. The memorial wall held dozens of inscribed stones. New volunteers continued to arrive, drawn by word of mouth about the healing garden. Sterling stood before the gathered crowd, maybe 100 people, a mixture of volunteers, community members, and local officials. He held Aldrich's first journal, open to a passage he'd marked months ago. "Aldrich Crowe wrote this in 1959, Sterling said. He wrote, "I don't know if building this garden will heal me, but I know that doing nothing will destroy me. So I choose to build, and hope that somewhere in the building I'll find reasons to continue." He closed the journal. Aldrich found those reasons. He spent 28 years creating something beautiful from grief. Then he tried to ensure it would continue helping others after he was gone. He failed in that final task, not through lack of trying, but through circumstance. But his vision survived in his journals, in his careful documentation, in the bones of what he built. Sterling gestured at the garden surrounding them. "What you see here isn't just restoration. It's completion. Aldrich started something, and all of us, everyone who's worked here, everyone who's found healing here, we finished it together. This garden belongs to everyone who needs it. That was always Aldrich's intention, and now it's protected by law and by community commitment." Garrett spoke next, sharing what he'd learned about his great-uncle, about regret and reconciliation and second chances. Helen unveiled a bronze plaque they'd commissioned, mounted on the stone bench, "Aldrich Crowe Memorial Garden. In grief we plant, in time we harvest peace. Established 1959, restored 2025, forever preserved for all who need sanctuary." After the ceremony, Sterling walked the garden paths alone, experiencing the quiet that had drawn him here a year ago. So much had changed. He'd arrived broken, hiding, hoping only for silence. He'd found purpose instead, and community, and a way to transform his own grief into something generative. His phone buzzed. A text from Judith, his ex-wife. "Kent sent me photos of the ceremony. I'm proud of what you've built, Sterling, truly." He stared at those words, proud. Not reconciliation, not romance, but acknowledgement, respect. It was enough. Sterling added a final entry to his own journal, which would join Aldrich's in the restored vault. "Today, we opened the garden to the community officially, completing what Aldrich started 66 years ago. I came here broken, thinking I was hiding from life. Instead, I learned what Aldrich knew, that life after loss isn't about returning to what was, but about building what can be. Some endings are just overgrown beginnings, waiting to be discovered. I found mine here. Others will find theirs. The garden stands ready for all who need it, as it always has, as it always will." He closed the journal and looked out at people walking the pathways, volunteers tending beds, visitors sitting quietly on benches throughout the property. The garden was alive with purpose, just as Aldrich had dreamed. Sterling had lost everything: marriage, career, home, dignity. And in that loss, he'd found something worth more than what he'd given up. He'd found a way to matter, to help, to build something that would outlast his own pain. A new visitor approached, a woman in her 40s, with the familiar look of recent grief in her eyes. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Someone told me this was a place for people who've lost." Her voice broke. Sterling offered her a pair of gardening gloves. "Let me show you something beautiful that grew from broken ground," he said gently, and together they walked into the garden, beginning again.